The first time I saw the LK Chen Double Dragon Sui Dao, I was excited. It was the first time anyone tried to replicate one-to-one the artifact that is famous that sits within the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. It comes in two flavors. One is a original length handle of 14.5 centimeters and one longer extended handle of 20 centimeters. I bought the 20 centimeter handle because I was afraid that this particular original handle might be too short for my hand, and the original handle length is for my friend. So I'll be reviewing both. So a historical background of the Sui dynasty. So the Sui dynasty was short-lived but significant in Chinese history in that it was the first time that the region was reunified under a single empire after about 170 years of chaos and breakdown of society following the fall of the Jin dynasty. So after Jin dynasty, a lot of the northern nomadic tribes started invading and displacing a lot of the northern Han Chinese into the south. And that sparkled a social breakdown. Essentially, it's a barbarian invasion in the Chinese proper, if you think about it. And that went on towards a northern and southern dynasty period where the northern regions was having a bunch of kingdoms that are competing each other by the nomadic tribes. And that nomadic tribe essentially arise from a lot of ethnicities, but prominently include Turkish and Siberian ethnicities. And because during that period, the northern region, the most powerful empire in that region was the Gokturks. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And the Gokturks was a large empire, by a early powerful empire by the Turks. And that region itself also had a bunch of wars with the Sasanian Persian Empire towards the west. So that because of this sort of regional turmoil, there's also facilitated a lot of cultural exchange and integration, probably forced integration, if you will. So that was an injection of a lot of just sort of Persian influenced design and culture through the nomadic steppes into the Chinese proper, and probably also vice versa, where you start finding Chinese silks in Rome and Persia. So in this case, also that period was also a rise of Buddhism within the period. So at the northern south dynasty period, the Northern Wei essentially introduced a very heavily adopted Buddhism into the Chinese central region, and which then became greatly flourished by the time of the Sui dynasty and also the subsequent Tang dynasty. So it is a key turning point in Chinese civilization where the classical Han civilization essentially was forcibly integrated with a new kind of culture, adopted from, injected into by the nomadic tribes from the north. And that essentially allowed the redevelopment, reintegration of this cultural identity and into sort of the Tang dynasty, the flourishing and a new height of the classical Chinese culture in a classical Tang dynasty culture. So the Sui dynasty essentially is a sort of a transitional important marker, milestone for that. And a lot of these can be seen in the sword. And they became quite different and distinct from the earlier Han design in terms of sword. And that's something that you can really feel and you can really handle. The strap system of the Sui Dao is very special. Essentially, at that period in the Sui dynasty, the Chinese design has essentially removed the traditional single clip belt system from the Han swords. And instead, they adopted the more Persian, Sassanid Persian design of having a two-pointed attachment strap, where you would have this very distinct ear, or you can call it a wave-looking attachment style. You can see this very similar looking attachment styles in similar period Sassanid sabers. It's actually very common. Also, you can see the same thing being kept in the later Tang period sabers. So the guard itself also is completely different and distinct from the earlier Han design. But what's unique though is that this particular pommel ring is very unique to Chinese sabers and weapons. And essentially this is a combination of the Han dynasty ring pommel it combines it with the double dragon motif of, the Chinese, the Han culture, that regards dragon highly in that period. And this is sort of a dragon with a fire on top of it. In this case, we'll call it a huolong, a fire dragon motif. Another way you can notice is that, the appreciation of the color scheme, right? So the adaptation of originally the gold and the silver material, the more yellowish metallic color scheme is different from the classical Han Chinese, black on jade kind of decorative piece. So this is a mark of, transition in religion. So during the Northern Wei period, in the Northern dynasties, the introduction of Buddhism and became widespread within China. So before, the classical Han period, it was more Taoism itself within the culture that was more dominant. But now, because of Buddhism and even introduction of Zoroastrianism, you can have what you consider the highest, decorative color motif became gold and silver instead of, jade and that kind of materials. So you can see that transition in culture happening all within this particular weapon. Given the ring, the Han ring, and also the Persian assassin design itself, you can also see that during the period, there's a cultural transition where the adaptation of a injected foreign influence in terms of artistic direction combined with the native Han design is forming a new fusion culture. So you can see the transition from the classical Han period culture over towards, the Tang culture, and the Sui period is sort of a transitional point in history. So later on, this style is adopted even further within the Tang period with additional other influences and towards the pinnacle of the High Tang culture. So, but you can see all these elements already present themselves in this particular weapon, and that's what makes it super interesting. The fitting itself is, once again, so the process, LK Chen's process always to 3D print the parts to design the fitting themselves, probably to cut the cost. You can see obvious 3D printed striation lines, layering lines from the casting mode itself on the guard, and there is also some markings of it on the double dragon motif. The rest of the fittings are made of a combination of brass and copper, giving a slightly different colored look. So the color choices, a lot of people would say that, well, how come they don't match, right? How come the copper is slightly redder, is slightly more of a reddish hue than the brass? And this choice is conscious on the part of LK Chen. So I was told that this is how they designed it to have this aesthetic. Essentially, the original had different colors to begin with in between the different fittings. So original had gilded gold on the pommel and also gilded silver in other parts of the fittings, giving a sort of a multi-colored look to it. And so that is sort of the artistic direction of that period, and that's what they liked. So to give the same kind of flair and also to reduce cost, what they did instead is to have copper and brass, and that reduced the fitting cost. And so that shifts the entire color spectrum hue a bit towards a more yellowish kind of look to it and preserve the spirit of the artistic direction of that age. I think it's, I don't mind it. I think it's an interesting touch. But at the same time, though, I also wish that they preserve more matching closely to the original color, because I think that's where the value of this particular build is, which is to mimic the original as close as possible. So I wouldn't mind it having, a brass part here and perhaps some other parts like stainless steel or even aluminum parts just to match the color of the original. Maybe iron is not a super great idea because that rusts easily. So maybe a different kind of part that doesn't rust but still have a silverish look to it. The handle comes with this particular protrusion that's essentially exists on the original, and it comes with external ring that attaches to it, probably a tassel decorative of some sort. I'm personally not a fan of the tassel. I've never been a fan of tassels on Chinese swords, so I remove all tassels whenever I can because I find it to be a hindrance when handling it. So originally tassels were lanyards. They were actually extension of lanyards that tends to be, you loop around your wrist. And over time, they become very decorative and they became sort of having this sort of, the distinct Chinese style. The tassel on this one itself, I have a mixed feeling about it. The design of the tassel is more of a modern or late Qing dynasty design, which is, I'm not sure fit the period to begin with. looking at some paintings and some paintings of what tassels may look from the period, I think it looked a little bit different. So I would have preferred something else there. So the ring direction. So there has been some guess as to why this is here, right? Because it seems that if you hold on to it and you slide your hand around, this really will bother the hand. And some people even suggested that maybe this was held on the left hand. So perhaps this was actually held on the left side like this instead of on the right side. Or maybe the original holder of the saber is actually left-handed. By looking at some paintings, I don't think it's true. Looking at some tomb murals, for example. And I think what happens is that this is a right-handed design. Basically, it doesn't actually bother the hand that much at all, if at all, given this, for my hand size anyways, given this guard design. And what happened is that you really want to show off that tassel or whatever the decorative piece attached to it was, and you sort of want this on the outside. And that's like essentially what they did for that period. So this is the design of the period. It's accurate. I think the part is probably a little bit weak and easy to come off. It's likely that this sword originally was not designed to be a battle sword to begin with. It may have been for parade purposes. Or it simply is for upper class aristocrats, and they're not really expected to go into battle, right, with weapons on hand. Anyways, the length of the blade, both versions of the handle are identical in length. So the blade is forge folded, you can tell from an acid etched pattern is pretty prominent. I think it looks fairly good. The blade is straight, has a very subtle distal taper. It is a fairly thin blade and is not very heavy. It is reminiscent of the Han Dynasty sabers, the Han Dao, if you will. I think what happened was that if you look at the actual museum pieces, there's no way that they can pull this thing out of its sheath because it's sheathed by rotten wood, essentially. Underneath the covering of his rotten sheath in the actual replica. So what happened is that there is a different saber beneath it, and they took that edge as the reference and put it on this particular fittings. That seems to match the profile of that particular saber. If I looked at that particular profile image though, I didn't see a strong evidence that it has a chiseled profile. The factory sharpening of the edge is okay sharp. But it's also, to the touch though, it feels as reasonable. So I've been cutting with it with a factory edge. It doesn't cut into things very well. I try to cut into light targets, they're all okay. But as soon as you try to switch into more heavy targets, it really doesn't cut very well, especially compared to the Frontier Tangdao. And I also think that given the chisel profile, it's never really gonna be having that much ability to easily glide through a target to begin with, simply because of the profile shape. So given the profile, maybe it was more for anti-armor, just so that it has a bit more cutting power within the blade itself. But that also doesn't quite make sense to me, just because the blade is not heavy, right? It's not as heavy of a blade as the Tangdao, the later Tang Dynasty blades, obviously. So I'm not certain the choice of the edge itself. I'm not sure if the profile edge it really is historically accurate. And I think the profile can be improved if it's not, so that it has a better cutting ability for this particular saber. The balancing point is fairly close to the handle, and I think it's very comfortable to hold for this particular saber, especially how the blade itself with a shorter handle. So the shorter handle, it's very comfortable. So what happened is that if I put my hand close to the guard, right, like this, where you can see that, so given the two-hand guard like this, you can see that the protrusions of the guard, they can rest on one on top of my index finger and second on the base of my palm, sort of within the grasp of my fist. So that allows it to have a lever-like effect. So when I rotate my hand, the rotational, translates really well to the blade. So the response is extremely good and the control is very efficient. And the worry about, the handle itself, the protrusion of this particular fitting is too close to the hand and start, grazing against it was, for me at least, unfounded. Because if I hold the saber in this way, there's actually a lot of space and I never feel it, right? This particular protrusion. And the balancing of the ring pommel here, the balance of the weight of the ring pommel actually give the saber a very responsive and very nice balance to it. So I think it's a plus. I don't find these, these plum flower decorative pieces to bother me that much when I hold it. So I don't think it's really a problem. So altogether, I think the short-handled version of it, the handling is very comfortable. And I believe this is the way to go if you are to choose this particular saber. The long version of the handle is a different story, even though it's only, well, it's extended by 5 centimeters. And the 5 centimeter extension actually makes a lot of difference in the handling of the sword. And I have to say, I am not a fan of it. I don't like it that much in the sense that because it's slightly longer and because now the counterbalancing weight of the pommel is further from this hand, when you swing it, right, the response time of how it translates, and I can really feel the difference between response time when I swing my hand this way in terms of how fast my hand rotates and how fast that rotation translates to the tip. And I feel like it's so much slower, right? It's so much slower for this particular action to happen. And so it makes it a kind of a subpar single-handed weapon. And because the extended length of the handle is meant so that, two-handed can be better, is better suited for two-handed wield. But I feel like if you do this, if you hold on to it, you can feel that the other hand now situates exactly on top of that protrusion. And that's really uncomfortable, given the few swings. And because of the way that is sort of rub against the finger, and if I want to, have better control, you're sort of liable to want to shift that grip down a bit. So you hold on to the pommel. But the pommel is also too large to fit the other hand on the base. So altogether, just not a very comfortable hold. And so if you want to accelerate the blade with this hold, it's just uncomfortable. So the hand is unwilling to exert that much power to accelerate the blade. So I find it to be a decision that was kind of, doesn't really do it for me because it makes a kind of a subpar two-handed design because really the base of, I don't think it was designed to be two-handed to begin with. And it also makes it a subpar single hand because now it's nowhere near the response of the original length. So I don't recommend the longer length. The only thing nice I can say about the longer length is it looks better. Well, that's aesthetics is your personal choice. I chose it because I was afraid that maybe I don't have enough room for my hand to hold on to, but I think that turned out to be a poor choice on my part. Personally, I don't think it looks better now. I personally prefer the shorter handle look. So I think the lesson for me is, don't change what works, right? Don't change a design of a historical design when I don't understand it. It's just a bad idea because everything comes together in a way that is only apparent when you start handling it. My gripes of this weapon is that I find the quality, the quality assurance process a little bit spotty sometimes. I'm not sure you can see it, but there's a bit of a leftover molding mark that left a green tint at the base of the pommel. Also, for this particular one, which is for my friend, the part fitting right below the guard, where it touches on the seal of the sheath there, it doesn't fit exactly right. There's quite a bit of a gap in terms of how these two parts fit together. And also, this part turned out later on to be actually come loose. Let me see if I can't move it right now, but so this part was actually also loose. In my piece, it's more prominent. You can see this particular marking within it. There's a greenish tint within it that is not properly polished and I think not properly cleaned in the QA process. The part fitting here is better, but that's kind of a general workmanship issue. And I find the ear markings themselves here, for example, is a bit rough, right, on the surface. So they're not super polished, and there's some rough workmanship that's still left over. So for a period piece that is to attempt to be, the highest workmanship, I think, replica of these tiny issues of QA, spotty QA kind of thing, it kind of leave a little bit. You just feel like the polish, the last 10% polish is just not quite there. But you know, that's what it comes for the cost, because honestly, the saber itself, I think right now, I think is now selling for 350 USD. It's not super expensive, so there is some trade-offs that you have to have. My recommendation for this one, for this particular weapon, is this is really the only accurate replica of the Sui saber out there on the market today. So you don't really have another choice. If you were to buy it, I would recommend to get the original length handle, because honestly, the handling is so much better as a single-handed saber. The blade is a little bit thin, I think a little bit light for it, and I wish the edge is not so chiseled. It's not a chiseled edge, and I think it will make a better cutter for a lot of people, especially given that I think that there is some choices in design of the edge that, you know, it's not 100% historic in terms of the replica. So there's some leeway there, and I think there's room for improvement. I think there's some improvement in QA process, and some last minute detail, the last 10% fitting can be improved for this particular thing. But overall, if you're looking to get a, you know, as accurate replica of this particular period sword, you know, this really is the best choice out there for now. So I hope you enjoyed that review, and thanks for watching.